From the description at the very beginning, there was something about, the papers should be related to computer science. I've gotten away now, until somebody kicks me off, of not following that twice. This paper is really important to me for a number of different reasons. And I'm going to point those out. Some of the things that I'm really excited about in this paper are certainly about the concepts that are in the paper, but also some sort of epiphanies or sort of insights that I got when I was reading the paper that are sort of meta, mind-blowing things. So the other reason why I want to give this talk is not just because I'm excited about it, because I think that it's important for topics like this to make their way through the world of software engineering and software operations, or whatever you want to call it these days. If I can't get this across to to you all, then I'm screwed. There's never a way. I mean, you all read these papers, so. The challenge, right, for this is a sort of basic PapersWeLove sort of deal. The challenge in translating a paper is that, of course, first and foremost, papers aren't written for practitioners. They're written for people who are like the authors of the paper, which means that they have to use language and vocabulary in a way that is much more defensible and much more, even if they use terms that are like obscure or sort of esoteric, they're like exactly the right words. And in order to translate them into words that aren't like in like weird pockets of the dictionary, it tends to make them much bigger. And so this paper is sort of like that. So some prefacing, the presentation and what's in the paper. Raise your hand if you read the abstract to the paper. Okay, no problem. I won't ask anybody if they read the paper. We're going to use some words that you definitely know these words, but you might not be used to hearing them in this particular context. My sort of level of success, my measure of success is that if you leave here thinking a little bit differently, a little bit more than you normally do about topics involving how you think at work, then this will be a success. So here's some of the context. The journal that the paper's from is Cognition, Technology, and Work. For those in the communities, sort of usually known as CTW, and the description of the journal is this. It focuses on the practical issues of human interaction with technology within the context of work, and in particular, how human cognition affects and is affected by work and working conditions. Got it? Okay. So this is from the first line of the abstract. What is problem detection? Well, the general gist here is the process by which people first become concerned that events may be taking an unexpected and undesirable direction that potentially requires action. The reason why I wanted to give this is actually is distinct from other things. Usually when studies of problem solving are done, and maybe some that you know, the problem's already been discovered. So in the case of CTW and the case of Gary Klein's work and Beth Crandall and Rebecca Pliske and Dave Woods and some of the others that's sort of associated with the naturalistic decision-making community, they do their research in the wild, right? Unlike traditional cognitive psychology, which is in like controlled conditions, reduce the variables, the Kahneman and Tversky's of the world, okay? What made this paper important, this was 2005, what made this paper significant is that it focused on something that for a very long time usually gets missed. Usually it's about how do people solve the problem, not how do people detect that a problem is there and is worthwhile to solve. So this is important, and so I want to sort of walk through some of these points because they're really they're really profound, and that's where I want to direct your attention, even if they seem really obvious once I say them. So having said this, all of that, problem detection is critical in complex real-world situations. And I'll assert, this is my editorializing, I'll assert that in order to improve people's ability to detect problems, we first have to understand how it even works. Fair? Most of you might be engineers. I would assume that you would agree. Once problem detection happens, a whole bunch of different things are available to us. People can seek more information, they can track events more carefully, try to diagnose or identify the problem, raise the concern, explain away the anomaly. They can try coping with it. They can accept that the situation has changed in fundamental ways and need to revise goals and plans. All of these things come almost, for anybody who has expertise in a specialized profession, come automatic, really, to us. So, what's inside it? What is problem detection made of? That's the gist of this paper. To bring it back a little bit, I want to give you this sort of these are quotes from two random quote-unquote post-mortem documents that I found on the internet today. I suspect that any one of you work at companies where this could have been written, right? Yes? Raise your hand if none of these are familiar. Okay. Like any other research paper in other domains, sometimes they can come as a reaction, or at least a little bit, and embedded in this paper is a reaction to existing work, right? It has an embedded little bit, actually it's not subtle, but it's not the real core thrust. There's a little bit at the beginning says, we believe problem detection is filled with these things, it's constructed in these ways, blah, 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 and this is different than how this other group said. And then at the very end, they sort of, along the way, they sort of say, see, they were wrong. See, that's how, don't read that other paper. This contrast is to a 1986 paper by someone named Cowan, who asserted that problem detection is really, and it seems intuitive, is that the accumulation of discrepancies until a threshold was reached. And the paper goes into a lot more about that, but that's basically the gist, which is you're doing stuff, you're engaged in some activity, and you'll see discrepancies, or you are somehow noticing or somehow perceiving discrepancies. No big deal, no big deal, no big deal, no big deal. Wait, it's past the upper water mark. Nope, this is something I have to pay attention to. And it seems reasonable. Klein and the rest of their authors say that no, actually this is not the case. They say, first, it's because cues to problems may be subtle and context dependent. And they also say that what counts as a discrepancy depends on the problem solver's experience and the stance taken in interpreting the situation. And then they go further to say, in many cases, detecting a problem is equivalent to reconceptualizing the situation. And that is to say, you didn't know you had a problem, and then you had a problem. This has absolutely nothing to do with what you're going to do about it. So, as a clarification, what they make, and this is the first mind blower here, is they make a distinction between problem detection, that is to say the initial factors that arouse concern, and problem identification, the ability to specify the problem. And I read this and I was like, what? Yes, totally, this is right. And so I've decided that there's only a couple of these on a slide where I had my mind blown. I put a mind blown emoji. They point out that detecting a problem and identifying that, or that is to say, specifying a problem, identifying the problem, having some knowledge of the shape of the problem. Sometimes it occurs almost simultaneously, enough that it is basically indistinguishable, but in not all cases that is the situation. They this is why they point out that most studies in problem solving tend to just totally pass over detection, and they sort of lump it in together with identification and definition, and especially everyone's favorite topic about problem solving, which is diagnosis. And so this was a little bit in the paper where they point out, like, these are definitely two distinct cognitive processes. This is the focus of the paper. So now, here's the thing about what makes Klein and the rest of the authors and sort of their types of research is they don't mess around in abstract hand-wavy land. They go out in the field, they put on their boots, they roll up their sleeves, and they do real field work. And so what they did was how they arrived at some of the things that they came to, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is they based this on existing cases, a huge amount of existing cases. And these were cases that are termed critical incidents. What makes a critical incident important to study decision-making and cognitive work? Well, critical incidents, that is to say, there's two parts of critical incidents. They have to be pressurized and they have to be consequential. If there are consequences for getting it right and consequences for getting it wrong, and there's some sort of pressure, time or complexity pressure, then that are the two basic elements. When you look at a critical incident, something pretty wild happens. Stuff that doesn't matter gets wiped away. So therefore, you have a much higher confidence about where people's attention are. You can't put somebody in an fMRI machine and say, where's their attention? That's not a thing. You have to make ever sort of amplifying inferences, and you do that through a sort of rigorous way of triangulation about what people do and what people say and what people said while they did the thing, and what other people said and did about what other people said and did, all of that sort of stuff. And the critical decision method, which Klein and Crandall really pioneered based on some other work by a guy named Flanagan. And part of the corpus of cases were taken from neonatal intensive care units, interviews with nurses, weather forecasters, U.S. Navy commanders, weapons directors aboard AWACS, which is like air traffic control for the military, but flying. Fireground commanders, that's in both urban settings as well as rural settings, space shuttle mission control, anesthetic management during surgery, and aviation flight decks. And so this is what he's known for. In fact, you might know, or have at least heard of Gary Klein's work through Malcolm Gladwell's book called Blink. And in fact, actually, Gladwell loves to point and reference to Gary Klein's work because it is actually really fascinating. This is the natural laboratory. And for the problem detection work, they also looked at some new cases, both in wildland firefighting and minimally invasive surgery. And I just want to point this out to sort of underscore this critical incident is in wildland firefighting. The reason why they wanted to use those cases is because wildland firefighters have to make decisions. What they will commonly do is they'll establish a safety zone to which they can retreat if conditions make it such that it's not safe to keep fighting the fire, right? But it costs, meaning it costs not just sort of time and energy, but also attention to actually make that retreat, right? So there's lots of ambiguity, lots of uncertainty, pressurized and consequential. And then the other three cases were laparoscopic gallbladder removal, right? And so this is not very intensive. It's pretty reasonably routine. But gallbladders, I've learned, I don't know much about medicine, but my colleague is an anesthesiologist, and I unfortunately know way too much. My stand-ups with Dr. Richard Cook every morning, that'll wake you up. The deal with laparoscopic surgeries is that it's minimally invasive, right? So there's a camera in, blah, blah, blah. But the issue is with the gallbladder and pancreas and all that part of the bodies, things go wrong, if they go wrong, they can go wrong really quickly, and it can be pretty serious. So surgeons always have to be pretty aware of whether or not to flip. Nope, we're going to an open procedure. And so this is what makes this type of decision making. It makes it quite what they call a target-rich environment for researchers. So. So there are 5 cases. I'm going to talk and briefly just touch on 4 of the cases. I'm only going to give, I think, one of the NICUs. If you read the paper, I just don't want to. They're a bit scary. I mean, in ICU, it's a bit scary. So I'm just going to read the high-level ones. So I'm just going to read. This is the only time that I'm going to actually read the case, and to give you sort of shape the rest of the talk here. So the first case is an experienced nurse and an inexperienced nurse. When this incident took place, I was serving as an instructor for a new nurse. We had been working together for quite a while, and she was nearing the end of her orientation. So she was really doing primary care, and I was in more of a supervisory position. Anyway, we were nearing the end of a shift, and I walked by this particular isolette, and the baby caught my eye. The baby's color was off, and its skin was mottled. It looked funny. Belly slightly rounded. I looked at the chart, and it indicated the baby's temperature was unstable. I also noticed that the baby had a heel stick for lab work several minutes ago, and then the stick was still bleeding. When I asked the orientee nurse how she thought the baby was doing, she said that he seemed kind of sleepy to her. I got the doctor immediately, told him that we were, quote, in big trouble with this baby. I said that the baby's temperature was unstable, that its color was funny, it seemed lethargic, and it was bleeding from a heel stick. He reacted right away, put the baby on antibiotics, and ordered cultures done. I was upset with the orientee that she had missed these cues, or that she had noticed them but not put them together. When we talked about it later, I asked about the baby's temperature dropping. She said she had noticed it, but had responded by increasing the heat in the incubator. She had responded to the surface problem instead of trying to figure out what might be causing the problem. The temperature had dropped each time over 4 readings, and she hadn't realized the significance of the pattern at all. So this is from one of the interviews that that Gary and Crandall did, and the point here is how the case illustrates how the underlying problem, in this case the development of sepsis in the baby, was inferred from a set of different kinds of symptoms. However, the experienced nurse was not simply accumulating symptoms. Her first glance at the infant told her something might be wrong. Instead of walking past, she began studying it in more detail. She detected the problems at the very first glance when she saw that the baby's color was off and his skin was mottled. The additional symptoms of temperature fit a mental model and explanatory scheme. The experience of the instructor allowed her to catch the pattern that the inexperienced nurse hadn't, right? So that was case number 1. Case number 2 is a little bit more straightforward. This was an Aegis naval battle group exercise. Don't worry about it. It's just a battle sort of war games exercise out on the water with aircraft carriers and planes. So everybody's there. They know it's all an exercise, and a person on the boat, they see 6 aircraft inbound at 250 miles, and the captain suspects that it's the initial lead flight, right? Followed by the main raid. Usually, what will happen is they'll put some small amount of fighters out, and then follow that with the big main raid. They sent 4 after them, and sort of handled the 6th, and then the main raid did come on a completely different bearing, right? And it was able to get in close, and it made it for a more difficult battle. So it was basically a distraction. They came in this way with the lead, but then the main raid came this way. The idea was that detecting wasn't the big issue, right? It was straightforward, and that is. So if you contrast case 1 from case 2, what Klein and the group does is draws a contrast. In case 2, they did not struggle with detecting. Did they have a problem? Yes. They didn't struggle with the detection of the problem. So therefore, they're not necessarily interested in cases like number 2. This was a mind-blowing moment for me because it meant that a couple of things. One, not all incidents wield the same potential. And I'm just going to be super blunt. If we imagine that all incidents in software all wield the same potential, meaning to say that the incidents have the same things to teach us, well, then we're going to miss out for a bunch of things. We will hit a one-size-fits-all. Some cases have elements and qualities that others don't. And a big part, and in this case, Klein was after learning how people detect problems. So therefore, he needed to look at cases that allowed that to reveal itself. Does it make sense? If there was a scenario, so in the case of the NICU nurses and a lot of these other places, if there's ambiguity, and especially in the case where they have a contrast between somebody who has experience and somebody who does not, you can almost swap out the nurses with somebody who's a master mechanic. The master mechanics that you take your car and they, open up the hood and they don't need the computers. They just listen. Yeah, you need valves. It's a valve job, right? Somebody who has like Land Rover master mechanic badges is like saying that right now somewhere. When you have that ambiguity, that uncertainty, and there's a contrast between people who have experience to pull that out, that makes for a good case. In this case for problem detection. We'll come back to this sort of case stuff. So then they go on to talk a little bit about this is really what is inside it. What are disturbances? What are the types of things that trigger problem detection? And so they said this, that in the incidents we reviewed, people did not receive cues and then perform inferences in order to determine if a problem had arisen. They did not do that. And I thought, what? Isn't that actually how people, that's how I think? And I was like, was not a typo? Is that what they really meant to say? They said that cues are not primitive events. They're constructions generated by people trying to understand situations. What this means is that if I put a piece of data in front of you, its meaning does not come along with the data. You are a part of it, right? This has huge implications. Raise your hand if you're in a business of building software tooling. Okay, I would expect that you should pay. This paper should be printed in large format on every wall, because I do believe it's really important. It means that your tool cannot deliver what you think it should without being contextualized in the experience of people. It just means that your marketing's probably full of shit. They said also that people can articulate the significant evidence as cues, but this process of abstracting cues often introduces distortions as oversimplifications, right? Cues are only objective, quote unquote, in a limited sense. Although they can sometimes be identified with objective data values like temperature and blah, 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 they're not purely input to be processed as if recognition was entirely bottom up. And they say rather the knowledge and expectancies a person has will determine what counts as a cue and whether it will be noticed. Make sense? This also totally blew my mind. So, faults. If you take in terminology, fault is a problem, right? These are effectively events that threaten to block some sort of unintended outcome. Klein goes to say that we don't directly perceive them, but instead we notice the disturbances they produce, and they call these symptoms or cues. And whether we notice these or not, depend on several factors, including data from sensors. Now I want to stop here for a second because I know the crowd we're talking to. When I say sensor, I don't mean I certainly do mean, but not just technological bit. In the case of cognitive work, a sensor, the way that they use it, also might be your vision, your visual perception, your auditory perception. Okay? You are still getting data from a screen when you look at Grafana. In this case, you'd be a sensor. So faults can be a number of different things, but primarily faults can be a shift in situations that goes from sort of a routine to deteriorating. They can be single or multiple faults, and the issue with multiple faults is they can complicate detection in that all symptoms may be attributed to the first fault detected, so that another possibly more damaging fault or fault interactions may go unnoticed. And potential. And this was a real eye-opener for me, meaning that the potential, actually the absence of a fault can trigger problem detection. So for example, increased wind velocity during firefighting. You become aware, if you're fighting a fire and the wind is picking up, right? That's a sort of a precursor type. Or it's you're detecting a condition, or for example, let's say you're working an outage and you realize, and at some point it becomes clear, or actually no, everything's fine. There is no outage, but you're aware that your AWS control plane is kaput, like somebody doesn't have the password or whatever. Something's broken with your tooling. You can't spin up or down any of your cloud compute stuff. Nothing's broken, but that's not a thing. Do you see what I'm saying? In the case of symptoms or cues, there's a whole range of things, and I thought this was really fascinating too. First of all, there's the speed of change, right? And so in the case of driving, sorry about I guess you could see that, it's not bad. Over here is a little bit worse. So for example, in less than a second, if you're driving, a hazard can show up, right? Or in the case of civil engineering, sometimes it can develop over years. So the rate at which changes that are going in a particular direction is important. Going sour pattern. My colleague Richard Cook sort of coined this as effectively a situation that is slowly deteriorating, but goes unnoticed because individually, each symptom in isolation does not itself signal some sort of that a problem exists, but it's only the accumulation. This is the difficult one because it only shows up in hindsight. The number and variety of symptoms or cues, right? So if there's a dominant symptom or there's a couple that may look like they add up, the trajectory, right? The difference between safe and unsafe trajectories are also unclear in hindsight. At the beginning of every outage, for example, if you've detected a problem but don't have any idea about the shape of the problem, the difference between this is just a crappy Monday afternoon and this is our business viability crushing event, this is our night capital moment. Bifurcation points. In some cases, there are known scenarios where there's going to be, oh yeah, this is normally unstable. This bit is unstable, but it always sort of works itself out. But there's always a judgment about that. Well, how long do we wait for it to see whether it stables out? And then there's the absence of data, right? And in this case, what is not present, right? There's a great Sherlock Holmes case. What was it called? I can't believe that. I can't remember. The Dog in the Night. Exactly. And he says, there's the key phrase that I'm.
The dog that doesn't bark.
The dog that doesn't bark. Exactly. He's like, yeah, that's exactly what basically led to the case. He said, yeah, but the dog didn't bark. He's like, right. So, let's talk case 3. During Operation Desert Storm, U.S. naval commander on board a cruiser received a report that the Iraqis had fired an Exocet missile in his general direction. He quickly prepared his crew to take defensive actions. This is not a group exercise. This has actually happened. He quickly prepared his crew to take defensive actions. However, he noted that none of the other ships in the area was generating messages about the Exocet missile. If a missile had been fired, all the ships in its general vicinity would have been detecting it and alerting others. He hypothesized that the report of the missile was probably inaccurate. He maintained a defensive posture, but shifted his primary attention to other matters. His assessment was correct. There was no Exocet missile. And so the key bit is this, which is that symptoms have to be viewed against a background, right? The context in which the symptoms showed up in this particular case influenced whether there was a problem to attend to or not. If the background's really noisy with lots of potentially relevant signals and distractors, then a person may not notice the symptom because it's not sufficiently indiscriminable. So, on the topic of sensors, it depends on, so remember, so sensors gather data. That data comes together or is being perceived as cues or symptoms, and that is actually what shows us footprints in the sand that a problem exists. So sensors can be either direct, like in the case of visual inspection, right? Or indirect in the case of displays, like in the case of software. So what does that mean? That means, yes, all of our sensing activity in software is indirect, because we don't actually see code execute, right? We see representations that lead us to believe the code has executed. All we get is through those representations. If you take me, you could take me to your data center and I say, show me where the code runs. You're going to point to a bunch of blinking lights, and I'm sure it's going to be very fancy. But I will, at the end of that day, not have seen code execute. So, completeness. These are a number of different bits that sort of characterizes sensors as sensor data. Completeness, that is to say, the number of sensors may not be adequate, the placement of them may not be adequate. You can almost imagine this as alerts in the case of Nagios. In the case of security systems, you can think of temperature or microphones. Sensitivity. For example, temperature probes that can't go over 150 degrees can't tell you that it's climbed to 500. Or if a teammate or system detects early signs of danger but doesn't announce this to other folks. The update rates. If the update rate is too slow, then it can make it hard to gauge trajectories. In this case, they actually didn't find this issue with surgeons, but they did find this issue with firefighters. Costs. Not all data can be collected safely. Let's take, for example, power plants. In nuclear power plants, there's some data that actually you can't get directly. You could try to get it directly. You probably won't last long enough to write it down, though, because of and that's why there's so much concrete. The ease with which you can adjust the sensors. Also, if it costs too much to change a threshold of a data collection, right, system. Let's say sampling. Let's say a plain old sort of Steve Souders-born web page performance. If there's sampling, then you only log instances where the latency is above a certain amount. But it's really hard to change that threshold. And by really hard, I mean there's some other team that's run by that asshole and you don't really want to talk with them, something along those lines. That also has an effect. And then finally there's credibility. Actually, not finally, second to last is credibility. I'll save the best for last. Perceived reliability. If you raise your hand, if I give you an hour, can you go find either an alert or a dashboard at work that you think is just, don't really trust that. All right, I think you get it. Turbulence of the background. And I think this is, I'm editorializing, I believe that this is really important. the turbulence of the background. It shows up in the exocet case and goes on further, and this is 100%, 1000% David Woods and his contributions. The symptoms of an underlying fault emerge against a backdrop. First, the paper says that operational settings are typically data-rich and noisy. Many data elements are present that could be relevant to the problem solver. Could be. There are a large number of data channels, and the signals on these channels usually are changing. The raw values are rarely constant, even when the system is stable and normal. The default case is detecting emerging signs of trouble against a dynamic background of signals, rather than detecting a change from a quiescent, stable, or static background. Right? The noisiness of the background makes it easy to miss symptoms, right, and explain them away as part of some other pattern. So, I'm going to spend like 2 slides on this. In the paper, they, as they go through, so that was sort of the description of disturbances that trigger problem detection and sort of gets you inside a little bit of the anatomy. They later describe problem detection as a sense-making activity, and sense-making is pretty complicated and depends on that's another 2 or 3 hour talk. So what I'll do is just try to do it in 2 slides. And it was the year before, in 2004, when this work around sense-making, the data frame model of sense-making came out. So 2004, then this paper, 2005. And this data frame model asserts that data is used to construct a frame, hold on that accounts for the data and guides search for additional data, right? And by frame, we mean a story or a script or a schema, okay? There's the data comes together and it tells a story for you. The frame a person is using to understand events will determine recursively what counts as data. It influences what you see as significant data that influences your frame. So both of these activities occur in parallel, both the data generating the frame and the frame that defines what counts as data. Okay? And so I'm going to put some LSD on, diagram. So this diagram's really dense, and there's a lot more to this. Basically, think of this as the section of the paper on the section on sense making. Sort of put this. My request is that you put it in your mind as a sort of a bookmark to dive a little bit deeper. Critical factors, and then sort of end with this sort of section, with the critical factors that determine whether cues will be noticed. Remember, Cowan said almost nothing about whether a cue will be or will not be dismissed. He actually only had one, this is the reaction to. There was only one, which is a discrepancy between intended values, intended outcome, and actual outcome, which is, or like a correct outcome, which is problematic. And they said this: expertise, stance, and attention management. Briefly, expertise, the ability to perceive subtle complexities of signs. And they give an example: a skilled kayaker can read the water ahead. The hydrotypography, reading the water, that can alert a kayaker to the presence of a submerged rock formation. All right. Number 2, ability to generate expectancies. This can't be overstated, really. Skilled personnel can construct mental simulations that allow them to generate explanations for events that occurred, tying them together in a story. The skill here is based on a rich causal framework and a richer model of situations. In other words, experts have not better problem-solving strategies, but experts have a richer set and more diverse set of experiences on which their data frame, that sits as their, that informs whether cues are counted as important. But the bit about expectancies, that expectancies are critical for detecting negative cues, events that don't happen, the dog that barked in the night, but were supposed to occur. and that violations of these expectancies are really important indicators. And then finally, mental models. And mental models of how sensors will work will help a person judge when to trust this data or not, and when to seek more information. So in case 4, I'm not going to read it, effectively it was another NICU case, and it was a baby that had low blood sugar, and briefly what happened is there were a bunch of signs that the baby wasn't doing really well, and they took some blood sugar, what is it called? Dextrose sticks, and the values kept coming back normal, and the nurse, multiple, 3, 4, 5 different values as normal, and sure enough, and the nurse said, no, we're going to blow through this because this is not actually consistent, and so her model of how these dextrose strips and the procedure for taking the blood and testing the blood and all of the sensor data was obliterated. She said, no, that's not a thing. I'm not, this is, and sure, and so they went for a non sort of stick test and got an actual lab test, and yeah, sure enough, crazy low, and baby survived. But had she not had this frame of blood sugar, basically a question, she was questioning her sensor data based on previous models. Stance is the orientation the person has to the situation. And a stance really, in Klein's words, can range from a denial that anything could go wrong, to a positive can-do attitude that's confident of being able to overcome difficulties, to an alert attitude that expects some serious problems might arise, to a level of hysteria that overreacts to minor signs and transient signals. And all of these things can be taking place in the same scenario, but between stance and expertise, both of these come together and have various relationships. And then finally, attention management. And there's not a lot on here. David Woods is really the sort of what I would call the OG on this particular topic, but this was not that paper. And effectively is that the management of attention, directed attention, and where attention goes, what's ignored, what's monitored, what's scanned for. Has anybody ever heard of inattentional blindness? Oh wow, this is great. People who have heard of inattentional blindness, you know the trick that I'm talking about?
Is it the gorilla?
It's the gorilla! Or the moonwalking bear, for those who are from England. Inattentive blindness show that people might not even notice stimuli that are right in front of that are absolutely in their field of view, especially if they're not expecting to see them or irrelevant to the task at hand. So, they list a number of sort of future directions, and the core, as you can tell, I skipped over a whole bunch about sense making. I debated, like, we'll be there till 10:30 if I do that. I think this is important. A lot of research papers say, here's some directions for future research. More intensive empirical studies. Yeah, I want to be doing that, and actually am doing that in software. Effects of variations in stance, expertise, and attention management. Effects of variations. Domain-specific failures, nonlinear resistance. I can't remember how to describe that. But it made a lot of sense when I read it. Human automation, teamwork, and coping with massive amounts of data. Again, both of those last two should be of great interest for you all. And I will assert that my colleague Dave Woods is, again, the OG on that. So the conclusions, there's just a number of conclusions. These are my conclusions. These are my views of conclusions that the paper came to. First is that problem detection hasn't been researched closely, and that was 2005, and suffice to say, I would argue that actually this is still the case. They make some pretty compelling arguments that Cohen got some things right, but for the most part, he's mostly wrong. That detecting problems in real-world situations is not trivial, and that what counts as important cues is context-dependent and heavily dependent on expertise, probably much more than we are ready and willing to expect, largely because in software, we are paid to deliver deterministic outcomes. And deterministic outcomes needs to necessarily be part of recipes that are inside the machine with ones and zeros, and not out in meat space. So what are some implications? A couple of implications. I already mentioned this should be major for Toolmakers. Okay? What I would do if I were them, and what I do as part of our work at Adaptive Capacity Labs, and which really focuses on incident analysis, using a lot of the methods that Klein and the rest of the authors sort of pioneered, but bringing them to software, is to find cases that have elements that support probing for problem detection expertise. And so contrast that first case was a good case, the NICU nurse case. The battle exercise, the naval battle exercise, was not, because there wasn't. It was straightforward. There was no ambiguity. Find those cases. Find those cases where, despite what cues looked like, people actually did work it out in almost sort of against all odds. On paper, they should not have gone with their gut, and they did. And that's what usually people say, well, it didn't feel right. Or I was like, oh, it was just an intuition. You know, when you're working with Rails for as long as I have, you just get that feeling. You know, like, something's wrong, something's not right here. They can tell you. It's not a feeling. They can tell you if you can go and ask them the right questions and ask them to describe. Anyway, so 2 slides left, 3 slides left. So you could say, but wait a minute. What about problem detection in teams? This paper was about problem detection in the context of individuals. You might say, but wait, teams have a lot of strengths that individuals lack. Team can attend to a wider range of cues than any of the individuals can, right? They definitely offer a wider range of expertise, represent different perspectives. They can reorganize their efforts to adapt to situational demands, right? And they can work in parallel, right? I'm saying these should improve problem detection. Teams should have greater advantages. Here's a spoiler. Not guaranteed. And they have other challenges, and therefore, 2006, your homework for today is to read the strengths and limitations of teams for detecting problems. That's my... Is anybody else assigned homework? Just say no. So I feel cool. Yes.
People have, yes.
Really?
Yes.
Awesome. I want to be in. I'm in that club now.
It's rare, but people.
Yeah. Of course, there's the advantage of I have no idea whether you'll do the homework or not. If you're at all interested, as I'm wrapping up here, if you're at all interested in some of this stuff, my colleague Richard and I wrote a chapter for this new book called Seeking SRE on SRE cognitive work, and we cite this paper. And if you haven't, for the love of God, if you haven't read the Stella Report, which came out a year ago, little over a year ago, which is the result of a 1-year project where myself and some others looked at incidents across 3 different companies: Etsy, IBM, which is a big computer company, and IEX, which is a trading firm here in the city. This also talks a decent amount about problem detection paper and others. And the best part is all the references for the Stella Report are freely available. No academic industrial machine putting up paywalls. That's the talk.
Thank you so much. We do have time for questions. So we're going to have people with microphones on the sides. Raise your hand. We'll call on you. You'll bring a mic, and then you'll say your question. So let's see. We got one right here. And just coming to you.
Can you clarify what the implications were for Toolmakers? I wasn't sure I followed.
Yeah. Right. So Toolmakers, so if you think about it, you could almost take so the implications for Toolmakers. If Toolmakers, let's see, all of these things and sort of turbulent background, if Toolmakers were to do qualitative analysis of people working through real, actual problems, not contrived, not workbooked, exercised with, but actually had an opportunity to go to potential customers and do this type of work, then it would be, as far as I know, very few companies do this. The type of work that Klein and Crandall and Hoffman and Woods and all of those folks is a very particular type of decision-making research, and it has lots of implications. We would end up with a lot more variety, for example, from a HCI standpoint, a lot more variety of displays and display design. A 2D Cartesian time series graph would not be as ubiquitous as it currently is. Some people are like, there's another kind of graph?
I thought line graphs were the only way you could display information.
Yeah. I mean, there's literally no other way. It's all those extra charts on Excel are just stuff to sell you stuff. I'm trying also really hard not to say you could hire my company and we'll help you.
We have another one right. If you pass the mic over to, right there. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned, when you talked about problem detection as a sense-making activity, you mentioned that the data was used to create a frame, and then the frame was used to interpret the data, which is a recursive process. I was wondering, it really sounds like something from catastrophe theory. I was wondering if problem detection, this recursiveness, where you can run trajectories in different direction, has ever been studied in this framework and ever helped.
So, and when you say sort of classification, you mean in sort of a ML direction? Is that what you're talking about?
No. I meant the data and the frame, and then it's like a recursive function,
right? Which
in catastrophe theory can go in different directions. You can have bifurcations, which you also mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, so it depends. So the answer is yes. That work has been done. Does it produce? Is it done in naturalistic, within the frame of naturalistic decision making, meaning studying cognition in the wild, in real world scenarios versus in the development of theory? I'm unaware of it. I can confidently say that that such work exists. In the real world, it almost certainly doesn't yet.
So, in case one, you described the assertion of the more experienced nurse being able to detect the pattern and apply a different approach and resolution. Is it possible that the orientee nurse was seeing one aspect of the symptom and applying a mitigation and only got up to Cook's going sour condition, that the more experienced nurse was able to identify that pattern?
So it's a good question. it's not included in this particular paper. This study, the work that Klein and Crandall specifically did with these NICU nurses, it's referenced a lot of those studies, and their use of the critical decision method is cited in a number of different papers, in at least probably almost all of Klein's books, and a number of different sort of textbooks on cognitive task analysis and cognitive work analysis. My guess says, my guess says no. In the case of in this particular case, the focus was on detection, wasn't with anything that happened afterwards, right? And so that's really the in this particular case, their focus was on the problem detection, not what to do about it later. And that's the tough part. That's why I said at the beginning, the idea of problem identification and problem detection being distinct cognitive processes is so hard to wrap your mind around, because it's almost always like right next to you. And to develop explanations for something that you see out in the world, if it assumes that they are always the same, then that's sort of missed out. Is it? I don't know. I can ask Richard and see what he says.
We have one up here.
So as you point out, this paper was 13 years ago, and the homework is 12 years ago. What about any more follow-up research or developments in this space?
Well, there's been a lot of so as far as follow-ups on particularly in problem detection, there are 55 official, 149 if you go by Google Scholar, but who knows with those people. But as far as CTW is concerned, there are 55 citations. A decent amount of them are actually in medicine. Outside of Klein's paper about teams, upon which a whole bunch of stuff has actually sat on, this particular, like those future directions, I actually don't know. Outside of the cognitive systems engineering and the resilience engineering work that Woods has done on human automation teaming and coping with data overload, those two absolutely have. I'd be here all night, and there's lots of work in those directions. As far as either contesting the data frame sense making model application to problem detection, I'm unaware. The NDM, the naturalist decision making community, tends to run pretty tight, meaning like it's a small group. I'm only the weird dude from software who just thanks them for letting me hang out with them. I'm unaware. It's possible though. My hope is that you all would do what I did, which is that you would read this paper and papers that are like this, and that number one, what was it? More empirical studies. The future directions, more intensive empirical studies. That is what is needed. There was a world when this type of research only happened, or let's just say human factors research only happened in aviation, period. And sometime in the 80s, people who studied aviation saw across with cognitive work challenges in aviation and military systems to medicine. And that took place sort of the mid-'80s through the end of the '90s. Software hasn't. You're looking at it. This is it. This is when these things are bridging. And so my hope is that you all would, you all don't have to go get degrees in human factors, but you'll all start making assertions, or at least asking good questions of this work.
All right, that was tough to follow, but thanks very much. This is really great. This question, it might be more relevant to the homework,
Yeah.
but when you were describing the stances, I couldn't help but like think of a lot of the like Upton Sinclair, like you can't you can't make someone understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about if in this paper or the follow-up or in other research, like how did that obscure problem detection when someone is sort of willfully ignorant to it?
Yeah, so I willfully ignorant. Well, so I can give you pointers. It's not in the Klein paper, I'll tell you that. When Klein's work is largely focused on, it's not oblivious to or ignores things like hierarchical or power dynamics in an organization. However, there's a great translator of Klein's work that does touch on those things, and that's Sidney Dekker. And I would argue that if you find a world where decision-making and theory from Michel Foucault were to overlap, it's likely that Sidney has his name on it. So that's the direction that I would push you in. Suffice to say, settle in and just give yourself a lot of space and, a lot of self-care as you read some of that. Or just like wait like 10 or 15 years or so. It'll all still be relevant then, but maybe the news cycles will be less depressing.
Yeah, Foucault is always a hard homework assignment, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Right here.
So it sounds like that wasn't part of the paper, but can you speculate how do you increase ability to problem detect? And also on the stance part, which are there some stances that are more productive versus not, like hysteria seems a little bit less productive, but maybe there's value there too.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, I think what in this case, the call is so let me take. You had two questions.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. The first is that I'll give you the high-level bullet point, and then as apparently I am ought to do, I'll also tell you the paper to read more about it. The idea that expertise is that there are characterizations of expertise that I touched on it earlier, that encompasses a corpus of experience with technical systems and tools and tasks that have elements that are wide-ranging, right? You've seen a lot of action. Raise your hand if you've ever seen a problem where you spent hours to find out that you ran out of file descriptors. Okay, note, not everybody in the room has done that. Most of the older people, I think, actually probably have. That's the sort of thing. The issue that Klein and Robert Hoffman in another paper called Seeing the Invisible point out is that a promising route of accelerating expertise is to create the conditions for vicarious experiences. Vicarious experiences are finding scenarios where experts can be, experts' knowledge can be elicited, and tacit knowledge. This is what Klein's critical decision-making, his critical decision method is aimed at eliciting tacit knowledge. The thing about experts is that experts are not necessarily expert at describing what makes them an expert, but you can assist them using particular methods. And if you can do that, if you find a scenario where experts can describe in context their rationale, what they see, what they did, how they thought through a problem, why they dismissed things, why they dismissed routes of diagnostic or therapeutic activity. Well, in the case of detection, why they dismissed one cue versus a different cue, and actually went further with these cues that other people may have dismissed, but they stayed on. then what you've done is you've created vicarious experiences for more novice people around them. By the way, what I just described is the world where your postmortems should look. And I swear I did not plant you. You can hire us and then we'll tell you how to do it. But that is no joke. That is it. That is it. This is, again, probably the fastest way, the easiest takeaway is to, here's a tip. Your next postmortem, write down the questions that were asked in the meeting, not just the answers. And then study the questions in a separate meeting. Okay, that's one route. But seeing the invisible, there's an entire book called Accelerating Expertise, which is all right, but you could probably just get most of it from seeing the invisible.
I think we got time for one more if someone has another question. Right front. You get my mic. Look at that.
Thank you. For probability detection versus identification, in order to get that studied by academics in the software realm, do they look at technical publications that we do on blog posts? Everything broke, here's what happened. If we put down, hey, this is how we detected the problem, instead of just, this is how we were identifying what was going on, would that help the industry? The academia?
I think that the intention is great. The answer is no. And the reason for that is that when we say detection in a blog post, or we detected this, that's a label. Right? Problem detection can be, and this is what's significant about this paper, can be found, right? And it's not generally found. This activity is not found by a person that typically labels it being problem detection, right? Because we do not have, privileged access to our own cognition. So what would do is, what would help is getting, well, there's a number of different things. One is start reading about this type of stuff. Two is start inviting people who know how to do this work to come. Nobody would trust a blog post written by anybody that said that we detected this problem. First of all, who is we and what is the problem? And what did you detect? And how did this? So the answer is, you pretty quickly realize that you need to be interviewed by people who know what they're doing. But that's the route. That's the route. And what you'll see in the Stella Report, that is the result of 3 different organizations, a incident happening at each of those organizations, and that is the output of people studying cognitive work in those scenarios. So that gives you an example of what that sort of thing looks like.
And on that note, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again so much.
Thanks for
John
listening.
and Lydia.
Thank you.